Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our series, The More Perfect Union. This series, the United States Capitol Historical Society decided to do last October. And it is a 6-part series that is focused on the continuing process of working toward having a country that meets the values laid out by our founding fathers. Interestingly, our founding fathers, yes, they were all men. Yes, they were all white. Some of them even owned people as slaves and thought that was okay. But nevertheless, they put together a document that called for equality and justice. And that has been the ongoing effort of this country. And that's what this series is about. Today, we are blessed to have Dr. Manisha Sinha with us, who is a leading scholar on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction. She is currently at the University of Connecticut and was educated in Columbia University, where she earned her PhD, and her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. Her book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015. She continued to be recognized as a scholar, earning fellowships, teaching all over the world on this matter. She was an advisor and an on-screen expert for the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, The Abolitionists. And so we are very fortunate to have Dr. Sinha here with us in today's series. This is February, which is, as you know, Black History Month. Although at the Historical Society, we tend to do Black history all year because we think that the history of this country should include everybody, men, women, people of all races and backgrounds. But we do, put special focus in February because we want to honor that effort. Dr. Sinha, would you please join us there?
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. And thank you, Sam, for inviting me to speak today, and to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for hosting me. I will share my screen with you so that you get a sense of what I am talking about, because this is an enormous topic to look at the history of Congress and the history of slavery and the afterlives of slavery, which includes emancipation and Reconstruction. And basically, I am a historian of the long 19th century, and I see Congress as having played a pivotal role in that transition from being a slaveholding republic to an interracial democracy, which took place, of course, during the Civil War and the period immediately after the Civil War that we call Reconstruction. So, to start, I think it is important to note that our Constitution was certainly inclined towards liberty and rights for all in spirit, but that it also contained certain specific clauses that compromise on the issue of slavery, which resulted, of course, in a system of government, both in Congress, but also the presidency, which was dominated for the most part before the election of Abraham Lincoln by Southerners, and mostly slaveholding Southerners. And right at the start in the 1790s, as the American Republic is born, Congress does pass a number of laws that recognize slavery and give it added protection. The most important of these was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, which was contested by abolitionists and by African Americans themselves. In fact, one of the petitions against these kinds of laws was signed by none other than Benjamin Franklin, who at that time was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. His petition and the petition of the society was sort of hooted out by Southern congressmen who claimed that Franklin was senile at that time, but in fact, Franklin had the better politics, certainly, and a certainly better understanding of what the American Republic should stand for than many of these Southern congressmen. But these laws that were passed in 1790s, like the Fugitive Slave Law that activated the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, gave Southern laws of slavery a sort of national recognition by demanding that Northern states that were in the process at that time of abolishing slavery return enslaved people as fugitives back to Southern slaveholders. So it gave Southern laws of slavery national recognition, which was unfortunate. And in the 1790s, Congress passed a number of laws that consigned African Americans to second-class citizenship. It excluded them from immigration and naturalization into this country. It excluded them from the militia. So a number of laws that were passed that sort of cemented the Republic's reputation as one that was recognizing slavery in law. This did not sit well, of course, with many Northerners. And it's not as if Northern congressmen and abolitionists did not continually challenge this. There were, as I said, certain protections for slavery in the US Constitution. The 3/5 clause that gave slaveholders extra representation in Congress. Certainly the Fugitive Slave Clause, but also a clause that said that the African slave trade could not be abolished before the year 1808. So, despite these clauses, the laws that were passed in the 1790s tended to consolidate the power of slaveholders within the nation. Northerners, as I mentioned, challenged this constantly, and it came to a head with the entrance of Missouri into the Union, and whether Missouri would be a slave state or a free state. Many Northerners had started fearing what they called increasingly the slave power and its inordinate presence in our government. Ironically, they got extra representation for owning slaves because of the 3/5 clause, which was a highly undemocratic clause, of course, not to mention that it rewarded people with political representation for literally owning enslaved people. The Missouri Compromise was a result of this whole controversy over whether Missouri should enter the Union as a slave or a free state. And I, as a historian, really enjoyed reading those debates over slavery in Missouri, because you can see the best of American history and you can see the worst of American history. You can have Southerners, touting out positive, good arguments about slavery, highly racist arguments about how people of African descent will never be equal. And on the other hand, you had Northerners like Rufus King from New York and others who constantly cited abolitionist arguments, used the ideals of the Declaration to argue that Missouri should not enter the Union as a slave state. The compromise that Congress passed was, of course, known as famously as the Missouri Compromise. And you can see from the map, it's the southern border of Missouri. That was the latitude 3630. And the idea was, this is all the territory that was gotten from the Louisiana Purchase, that slavery would be allowed to expand below this line, but not above that line. The understanding was that this would be free territory. And this is how Congress sort of solved the problem of slavery. And after the Missouri Compromise, there's really a political silence over the issue of slavery, except by abolitionists and by African Americans themselves, who are constantly petitioning, who are constantly demanding that Congress do something to prevent the expansion of slavery and to put it on the road to ultimate extinction, as Lincoln would later say. Would this country be free or slave was the biggest debate of the 19th century, and that debate played out on the floors of Congress. The next time that the issue of slavery really comes up in Congress is the so-called Gag Rule Controversy. This rule, which was put into place by the House in 1836, automatically tabled all abolitionist petitions coming to it. Abolitionists demanded that Congress act against slavery in areas under its jurisdiction, the federal territories, the District of Columbia. They thought that this was a matter of immense shame that a republic committed to the ideals of universal equality should have slave sales, literally, at the very steps of the Capitol. And they started sending these petitions into Congress. Earlier on, as I mentioned, Southerners had simply argued against these petitions. In 1836, they put into place a gag rule, a rule that automatically tabled these petitions. In 1840, they made it even more strict. They would refuse to even accept these petitions. And this rule lasted right up to 1844. The one man who became a sort of a hero to the abolitionist movement, even though he was not an abolitionist himself, was the former president, John Quincy Adams, who is the only president to actually then go on to serve in Congress as a representative from Massachusetts. And that's where really John Quincy Adams becomes famous. He argues a famous case in the Supreme Court you might have heard of on behalf of the Amistad slave rebels. But in Congress, he becomes a champion of abolitionist petitions. He devises various parliamentary tricks in order to actually make sure that that abolitionist petitions are heard of. Before the rule could be put into place, he would jump up and say, you know, I have a petition from an abolitionist, and he would try to read those petitions out. And he became famous for that. He did not agree with a lot of the abolitionist demands because, like many anti-slavery congressmen, he was committed to the union with slaveholders, but he did believe that they had a right to be heard. And this is when the cause of the slave, the abolitionist cause, becomes increasingly linked with the fate of American democracy itself, because it becomes a matter of civil liberties, of free speech. Abolitionists are being attacked. Their literature is being burned in Southern post offices. So increasingly, many Northern citizens are seeing the cause of the slave as linked to the broader cause of American democracy. And Northern congressmen, especially the so-called conscience Whigs, at that time you had the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, the Republican Party was not yet born. Somebody like John Quincy Adams were making these arguments. They were arguing that Black freedom was linked to the survival, the very survival of the republic and democracy. And these were the ideas, of course, that Lincoln would bring together very well in his speeches during the Civil War. In 1844, Northerners, all the uproar against the gag rule, do manage to get rid of it in the House, but it persisted in the Senate right into the 1850s. The next sort of step where Congress becomes really involved with the issue of slavery is, again, like the Missouri Compromise debates, it's over the expansion of slavery. Now, after the Mexican War, the United States gets a huge amount of territory from Mexico. It annexes a huge amount of territory from Mexico, besides having annexed Texas earlier, before the war, which was one of the reasons for the war. And this issue of whether slavery should expand in the West, what will be the future of the republic? Will it be a free republic or a slaveholding one? Or as Lincoln put it in his House Divided speech, will we be one or all? That was the question of the day. And that metaphor of House Divided comes from the Bible, and it had been used by abolitionists before. Lincoln actually famously used it in his speech. But this question of the expansion of slavery comes up after the conquest of Mexican territories, and Congress passes the Compromise of 1850. Now, it's useful to note that in the mid-19th century, the people who really dominate American politics were the so-called triumvirate, people like Senator Henry Clay from Kentucky, Daniel Webster, from Massachusetts, known for his famous orations for the Union, and John C. Calhoun from the South, who defended slavery as a positive good, had introduced resolutions, was behind the spirit behind the Gag Rule, and who thought that the United States, in fact, should remain a slaveholding republic in perpetuity, and in fact, slavery should expand. That was his vision of the republic. Now, the Compromise of 1850 takes place mainly because of this debate over the future of the country. And you can see famous speeches there. Clay, on behalf of compromise, putting the Union first. This is when Clay becomes Lincoln's beau ideal of a statesman. Webster, who agrees to compromise with slaveholders on the question of the fugitive slave law and earns infamy in the North, especially amongst abolitionists. And Calhoun, who says, if you're going to admit California as a free state into the Union, we Southerners are going to secede. We are not going to accept it because we demand the permanent expansion of slavery, because in fact, it is protected by the US Constitution. And he has this vision of state sovereignty, virtually, where Southern states could assert their slave laws everywhere in the nation, whether it is in the North or in the Western territories. And interestingly enough, you will not remember many of the precedents of this period, but you will remember these congressmen like Clay, like Webster and Calhoun because of their speeches. Now, what was the compromise? It strengthened the fugitive slave law, which was being defied both legally in the courts and in state legislatures in the North by abolitionists, and even in the streets by abolitionist vigilance committees. The draconian fugitive slave law made it virtually impossible for African Americans to escape slavery within the borders of the United States. And it demanded that the Northern citizenry act like a slave patrol in getting slaves back to the South. And this raised a lot of opposition in the North. It also resulted in it was a compromise. So it resulted in the abolition of slavery finally. And I should say, actually, that is wrong. My PowerPoint is wrong. I apologize. It resulted in the abolition of the slave trade in the District of Columbia, not slavery. Slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia only during the Civil War under the Lincoln administration. So please make sure you correct that in your minds, even though the PowerPoint is not correct. And it replaced the Missouri Compromise line. Remember that line dividing the territories with this notion of popular sovereignty, a notion that most people attribute to Stephen Douglas from Illinois, Lincoln's famous competitor. And Douglas's notion was that white settlers in the territories should simply be able to vote slavery up or down. This is not a moral question. If white citizens want slavery, they can have it. So even if, let's say, it's as north as Oregon, if white settlers there want slavery, they should be able to have slavery. And this raises a lot of controversy in the North too, because they don't want slavery to certainly spread to those northern territories. And California was admitted as a free state, and a minor part of it where Texas's debts were assumed by the United States. But this compromise was really more of an armistice, as one historian has put it, because when Clay tried to pass it as an omnibus bill, it did not pass Congress. But when they broke it down into 4 or 5 separate bills, it actually did pass Congress, with Southerners voting for the fugitive slave law and Northerners voting for the abolition of the slave trade, not slavery, and for the admission of California. It also led to a secession movement in the South that did not succeed. But this, right from the 1850s, Southerners are saying that we will secede unless slavery is given permanent recognition in the United States. It ends up with them demanding the reopening of the African slave trade, a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them, and also a federal slave code for the entire country. That was one of Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederacy, one of his demands. So this compromise was really not a compromise, because Northerners and Southerners voted for whatever part they wanted. And this sectional division over slavery was breaking down party lines in Congress. It led to a lot of confusion, even in the organization of the House. There were big controversies on who should be a speaker, which party should have the speakership. Even if it is a majority party, many Southerners would dispute that. So this controversy over whether the country should be slave or free continues after the so-called Compromise of 1850. This continues with the so-called Bleeding Kansas episode, when Stephen Douglas, with his Kansas-Nebraska Act, tried to enact popular sovereignty. This idea that the majority of white settlers in a territory should vote whether it should be slave or free. And this led to the organization of Kansas in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opened Kansas up to slavery. And it led to a virtually mini civil war, with free state immigrants mostly dominating, coming into Kansas, but also border ruffians from Missouri, the slave state of Missouri, being sent by this rabidly pro-slavery senator from Missouri, David Atchison. He would organize these ruffians who would violently intimidate and spread terror in Kansas and try to steal elections. In Congress, for the first time, you had a senator, Charles Sumner, from Massachusetts, and you may have seen his portrait from the Capitol Hill riots under, I think it was about the man with the Confederate battle flag. Charles Sumner was a known abolitionist, and he, of course, had resisted the fugitive slave law of the Compromise of 1850. He refused to recognize its constitutionality. He made a famous speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," where he talked about how democracy was completely being vitiated by these raids, by violence in Kansas. And in that, he actually pinpointed to Southerners who had passed the fugitive slave law, who were responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, etc. Now, I had read a lot of histories about the incident of Sumner's speech and his subsequent caning by the South Carolinian congressman, and all of them blamed Sumner for, quote, his radical abolitionist rhetoric. And this is why one should read the Congressional Globe. I went back to the Congressional Globe and I published an article on this way back in 2003, where I read all the speeches that Southerners had made, where they had made highly racist and personally derogatory speeches against Sumner. So to blame Sumner's rhetoric, not taking into account the way Southerners had continuously attacked him, was really doing a disservice to history. And I saw this repeated in books, in highly regarded books on the coming of the Civil War by highly regarded historians, in textbooks everywhere, and it exercised me. And this is why it's important to read the Congressional Globe and read those speeches. In fact, Sumner is assaulted for this speech by Preston Brooks. I read all of Brooks' speeches and justifications where he literally says, I gave him 39 stripes the way I would whip my slaves. And for Northerners, this was a real shock. The caning of Charles Sumner in 1856, it's what radicalizes John Brown in Kansas. But for many Northerners, to see a senator being whipped like a slave was shocking. Massachusetts, of course, protested this, but most Northerners did. Brooks was censured, but he was treated as a hero in the South, and he was reelected by his district unopposed. He died a few years later, suddenly, and he was fairly young. Sumner was so badly beaten that he could not go back to his seat. His seat remained empty for 4 years as a standing protest by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the assault on its senator. That remained the case right up to the Civil War. Now, it's true that there were many incidents, violent incidents between Southerners and Northern representatives, as Joanne Freeman has shown in her recent book. There were many instances where Southerners felt it was okay for them to not only adopt violent language, but violence against Northerners, especially those who were suspected of anti-slavery sympathies. And with the rise of an anti-slavery Republican Party, and I'm talking about the Republican Party of the 19th century, the party of Lincoln, of liberalism, racial liberalism, of big government, with the rise of this new party, because the Whig Party had disappeared, you had a lot of anti-slavery Northerners in Congress, and Southerners were constantly threatening them. And so that did occur. But the caning of Sumner was at another level, and it had an enormous impact. To see this violence on the floors of Congress was something that shocked the North. And it is one of those pivotal moments leading to the Civil War. And again, one of those moments that linked the rights of the slaves, or the slaves' freedom, with that of the white man's democracy. That is what I argue in my latest book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, where I look at the emergence of the politics of anti-slavery from the abolitionist movement. Going on, I would say that I think I do have sufficient time to talk about some of the amazingly positive roles that Congress eventually played with an anti-slavery Republican majority. During the Civil War, when Southerners, most of the Southern states, had left the Union, 11 of them, 4 remained as border slave states, but they generally tended to be thorns on the sides of Northern Republican congressmen because they refused to go along with many of these acts that I'll be talking about. During the Civil War, Congress really steps up. We think of emancipation and we think of it as a singular event, the Emancipation Proclamation or the passage of the 13th Amendment. But actually, emancipation was a process that involved many actors, including enslaved African Americans who, like fugitive slaves earlier on, ran to Union Army lines the moment the war started and saw the Union as their ally before the Union stepped up to that role. And you had the Union Army, you had Congress, anti-slavery politicians, abolitionists outside Congress, Lincoln himself, a man of deep anti-slavery beliefs, though not an abolitionist, moving towards emancipation. And it is important to know that Congress takes the first steps in this process by the First and Second Confiscation Acts. According to the First Confiscation Act, passed in the very first year of the war, they declare all enslaved people being used by the Confederacy free. They would confiscate them as property, but confiscate them and give them their freedom. The Second Confiscation Act declared all slaves of slaveholders in rebellion free. So it's a very close step towards emancipation, because what Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did was it declared all enslaved people in states under rebellion free, not the ones in the Union, not the ones conquered by the Union Army, but those in rebellion. So his Emancipation Proclamation went a bit further. You could have been a Unionist slaveholder, let's say in Louisiana, and you would still lose your slaves. But Congress sort of preceded that with the Second Confiscation Act, and most importantly, with the Militia Act of 1862 that allowed African Americans to serve in the Union Army. That was a very important step. It's not just a matter of military necessity. Once you allowed African American men to serve in the Union Army, you could not possibly deny them the rights of citizenship once they had performed the duties of citizenship. So very important, and one that was reinforced by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, in which he invited African Americans to serve in the Union Army. This process towards emancipation ends with the passage of the 13th Amendment in Congress. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever. It's been a matter of some controversy because it had a criminal exception in it. But this is not because of some design of the anti-slavery congressmen, who most of them were abolitionists. They simply adopted the language of the Northwest Ordinance of 1784 that had that original criminal exception. Unfortunately, Southerners would use that criminal exception to get around emancipation and convict African Americans for minor or for made-up crimes in order to take away their freedoms. But the 13th Amendment was a tremendous achievement in terms of getting rid of slavery, a tremendously important step in that transformation that I talked about of the country from being a slaveholding republic into becoming an interracial democracy. And its second section that empowered Congress to pass any laws to implement it is a sleeping giant. of the 13th Amendment, that Congress could then do this. They could pass laws to implement freedom, and we can still use the 13th Amendment and the later Reconstruction Amendments to pass national laws to protect the rights of citizens. This was a new idea, that the federal government had an obligation to protect the rights of all citizens in the country, this notion of national citizenship. The 39th Congress is my favorite Congress. I think I've read all the thousands of pages of debates of the 39th Congress for my forthcoming book on Reconstruction. The 39th Congress was really important because after the assassination of President Lincoln, interestingly enough, for his endorsement, the first president to publicly endorse Black citizenship, John Wilkes Booth assassinates him not for being the emancipator, but for endorsing Black citizenship. The 39th Congress takes on the burden of implementing emancipation and Reconstruction. What terms would the Southern states be allowed back into the Union? It is the most consequential Congress, in my opinion, in the history of the United States Congress. And it passes these really important laws. The first Civil Rights Act of 1866, the very first national Civil Rights Act, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which elongates the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal government agency to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom in the South. So this notion again of big government, of federal government intervention directly into Southern states to prevent Southerners from trying to re-enslave and put Black people to as close a state of servitude as possible. This is when the Ku Klux Klan is founded in 1866, and all these white terror groups in the South are trying to implement through terror what they had lost in the war, which was the abolition of slavery. And finally, the probably most important amendment to the US Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that establishes national birthright citizenship. You may have heard a lot of debate over this question of birthright citizenship. That was established by this Reconstruction Amendment, 14th Amendment. It also had a clause that prevented anyone who had participated in any sedition or domestic insurrection against the government of the United States, and therefore had violated their oath of office to the United States Constitution from ever holding office, a high office or state or local office. And that you may have also seen in the news after the Capitol Hill insurrection and the mobs and the riots that is being debated increasingly by historians today, but it was activated against former Confederates. And this idea that citizenship in this country should not be confined by race is captured by this illustration in Harper's, I think it is. And here you have Washington, Lincoln, and Ulysses Grant, who becomes president after Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, who became president on his assassination. He was a fatalist, one of the worst presidents in US history. He was from Tennessee, a Unionist, but also a former slaveholder, and who really tried to undo the results of the Civil War by encouraging white domestic terror in the South and completely arguing against any form of Black rights and Black citizenship. So really going back on all the results of the Civil War. He's not pictured here, obviously. In this picture, you can see that they are celebrating universal suffrage, not for women, but all men. But it includes Native Americans who actually were being dispossessed of their lands at that time in the West, and Chinese Americans who are whose labor is being used for railways and others in the West. African Americans, white Americans, this notion of citizenship based not on race, but on being born in the United States and having certain commitment to American ideals. And that's why we call Reconstruction a period when this ideal is born. And it is born in Congress. The 14th Amendment is often seen as nationalizing the Bill of Rights for all people. And even though it excluded women and introduced the word male for the first time in the US Constitution, its equal protection clause has been used recently by women to fight against discrimination on the basis of sex. This was Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg's argument. It was used, of course, for marriage equality recently. So it has been used, and for the right to privacy. So it has even been used by disfranchised groups like women to expand rights. So an extremely important amendment that Congress passed at that time. The most lasting legacy, I think, of Congress from this period in terms of really trying to undo the legacies, the political and legal legacies of slavery, was this period of Reconstruction. And the two men most responsible for that are some of my favorite American history congressmen, Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner. He recovered, he came back, and became the most eloquent spokesman for equal rights, regardless of race, in Congress. He continued to be Massachusetts senator till he died in 1875. And Stevens and Sumner are the ones who they're the radicals in Congress. And many of the amendments and laws are compromises, and sometimes moderates get their own vision of what should be there, but they're the one who lead the Republican coalition. They're the visionaries, or what one historian, famous Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois called them the seers of American democracy, because they are the ones who really pushed this notion of an interracial democracy and equal rights for Black people. So you had them pass the Reconstruction Acts, because under Johnson, Southerners had basically elected governments of whites, excluded Blacks, and passed Black codes that reduced African Americans to as close a state to slavery as possible. Stevens made sure that they would not be admitted to Congress. And the Reconstruction Acts put the South under federal military rule and gave Black men the right to vote and established interracial state governments. So this is what leads to the first African Americans being elected to local and state office, but also to Congress. The first Black senator, Hiram Revels from Mississippi, the first Black governors and lieutenant governors, the first Black congressman from South Carolina, virtually the entire delegation by the 1870s. And this kind of Black representation in Congress would not be replicated until the post-civil rights era. And so it was an amazing experiment in interracial democracy. They also impeached Andrew Johnson. He becomes the first American president to be impeached, and his conviction is lost just by one vote in the Senate. And he is impeached mainly for treasonous actions, even though it's a technical issue that they get him on, which is his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. He tries to fire Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, without permission from Congress, in violation of that act. But the reason why they really impeach him is because of his staunch opposition to Black rights and his extremely lenient policies towards former Confederates. He pardoned all of them, so that within a few years you would have Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, as a senator from Georgia after the fall of Reconstruction. But during this period, in fact, they passed far-reaching legislation, a 15th Amendment that gives Black men the right to vote directly, the Enforcement Acts, which are again being talked about right now, are really important in terms of putting down domestic insurrection. The three Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 were mainly directed against the Ku Klux Klan and against other white terror groups like Knights of White Camellia, White Liners, White Leagues, the Red Shirts in South Carolina. These were white terror groups that literally attacked Republican politicians, assassinated them. When people looked at the Capitol Hill insurrection, they were like, how can this ever happen? And it is unfortunate that, in fact, it did happen in the United States in the 19th century. I just didn't think we'd go back there. ever in our history. These acts were passed by the Republican Congress under the Grant administration. This is when the Department of Justice is formed also to put down the Ku Klux Klan. Again, an example of big federal government really taking into its jurisdiction these sort of powers to put down local domestic racist insurrections. And most importantly, this is Sumner's brainchild, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This act would actually be declared unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court, but it was one of the most far-reaching acts passed by Congress. Even in its whittled down version, Sumner's version was even more broad-based. It basically barred all racial segregation. Now think about this. This act was passed before you had Jim Crow in the South. So it was meant to prevent the rise of racial segregation and also the customary use of segregation that many African Americans were subject to, including African American congressmen. And they wrote to Sumner. They talked about their plight. And this is why Sumner introduced this bill. It became law as a tribute to him when he died at the tail end of Reconstruction. And of course, as I said, it was declared unconstitutional. But how visionary was this Congress was that many of these ideas were then passed with the Civil Rights Movement. Nearly 100 years later, we did get a Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed Jim Crow, and we got a Voting Rights Act of 1965 that tried to finally implement the 15th Amendment and even the Reconstruction Acts that had actually given Black men the right to vote. So it took 100 years for the promise of the first Reconstruction to be fully realized, mainly because Southerners, through a campaign of domestic terror and legal conservatism, managed to overthrow the Reconstruction governments and establish Jim Crow, economic and legal servitude for African Americans, lynching, racial terror. All that became part of the South, which made the South the nation's #1 economic problem, actually, as FDR put it during the New Deal. But what's important to remember is that Congress, through its legislation, played such an immense role in trying to secure the fruits of emancipation. And even though Reconstruction was overthrown, the Reconstruction Congresses set a precedent that I think most Congresses have not yet even been able to meet up. 3 constitutional amendments, amazing laws to completely get rid, not just of slavery, but also the badges of slavery, as people often said, and to actually implement our Bill of Rights for everyone, regardless of race, and to actually have equal citizenship in this country, even though initially it did not include women. So thank you. That is it for me. I hope I did not take up too much of your time. I will stop my share now. And we'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Well, what a great history lesson. Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha. We're looking today at the lasting impact, and you brought us up through Reconstruction. But then what happened was that Reconstruction was overridden with Jim Crow and redemption. And so we find ourselves, as we look at the lasting impact, that the promise that was there of a real multiracial democracy was denied. And that, do you have any thoughts about, you indicated that it took another 100 years before the Civil Rights Act was finally enacted and acknowledged by the Supreme Court. What do you think is the lasting impact of the loss of the progress that happened at Reconstruction?
That's such a great question, Jane, because when we think of American history and we think of American democracy, we tend to think of it in a linear fashion. We think of, republic being established and then freedoms being expanded, right? In a linear, unproblematic fashion. But actually, if you look at the history of American democracy, one realizes how contested it was, how there were always people fighting against progress, and there were always people fighting for progress. So those who say, oh, well, we began as just a country that recognized slavery are also not right, because you had people fighting against slavery right from the moment the republic is born. At the same time, during Reconstruction, white Southerners just refused to accept their defeat. What they could not win in the battlefield, they did win eventually with the overthrow of Reconstruction, which is one of the biggest tragedies of American history, is the overthrow of Reconstruction and the backlash that follows. Most historians trace it to 1877, when you had conflicting electoral returns from three southern states, and you had a kind of a compromise that put a Republican in the presidency, but led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. That gave free rein to white Southerners. It took them some time. They could not completely undo the gains of Reconstruction. It's not until the 1890s that they are completely able to. It takes them, 30 years to establish Jim Crow and then get Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, from the Supreme Court that validates their segregationist laws. And the Supreme Court simply weakens all these constitutional amendments by letting Southerners get around them. And so it's a campaign of terror, but there's also a systematic legal strategy that goes right up to the Supreme Court, which is extremely conservative. It's not until Brown v. Board of Education that the Supreme Court starts interpreting the Constitution the way the authors of Reconstruction intended it to. And interestingly enough, when Thurgood Marshall pleads the case there, he uses Sumner's arguments against against segregation in the Boston public school systems from the 1840s. So these things also live on. And I think as Americans, we should realize how precious our democracy is, and how this thing is being contested, and how we need to constantly fight for our visions of democracy, because the overthrow of Reconstruction meant the overthrow of democracy. Let's not forget that. Black people were a majority in places like South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, nearly 40% of the population in places like Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Texas. I mean, there were large amounts of these populations of these states. And so what you had was tyranny. And what's really sad, what people don't know, is that when you had the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, Hitler actually looked to the Confederacy, and he looked to Jim Crow South, and he looked to the violent dispossession of Native Americans as models for his racial ideas. So we should even think of American history in a global sense too, about democracy. We think of our country as an example to the rest of the world. We should also think a little bit about how contests that may have failed domestically in the South also have a global impact. So the fight for democracy is ongoing, and that's something that I think most American citizens need to realize, that it's not as if we won certain things and we can rest on our laurels. We continue to fight for a more perfect union.
Well stated. And we've got a round of let's do lightning rod, because we're up against our time. One of the questions someone asked, can people view this session and previous sessions? Yes, all of the videos are posted on our website. You can look at our events calendar and see any event, and it'll click you right through to the video, so you can look at it, share it. They're available for anyone to have. Two questions we kind of put together. Could you distinguish, you talked about anti-slavery and you talked about abolitionism. Is there a difference? And if so, what is it? And then how did the advantage that the slave states had in Congress influence the acceptance of Jim Crow and the ability to sort of destroy Reconstruction?
Very good question. So first, the distinction between abolition and anti-slavery, the way I use it in my book, The Slave's Cause, is to look at abolitionists as the movement activists who demanded the abolition of slavery, period, and Black rights. People forget that abolitionists were fighting against Jim Crow in the North and for voting rights for Black men in the North. Many Black men did not have the right to vote except for a handful of New England states in the North. So that was being an abolitionist. You believed in the immediate abolition of slavery, even though that might result in angering slaveholders, and you believed in equal citizenship. And that's where the Reconstruction anti-slavery politicians like Stevens and Sumner get their ideas from. Now, where do they get this idea that Black people should be equal citizens of this republic? They get it from abolitionists. Now, you could be an anti-slavery politician, a moderate one like Lincoln, let's say. Most of the Republican Party was an anti-slavery party. It was a coalition of anti-slavery moderates, conservatives, and radicals. And so their platform was the non-expansion of slavery, but also that the federal government should act against slavery in areas under its jurisdiction. This is an abolitionist idea again, because abolitionists are petitioning Congress to do that constantly for 30 years. So people like Sumner say freedom national, slavery local. Or what Salmon Chase said, the denationalization of slavery. Let the federal government act against slavery wherever it can. Some people said it can even abolish the interstate slave trade because that's interstate commerce. So they, imaginatively thought about how to use the Constitution to act against slavery. The difference is that anti-slavery politicians always acted within the constitutional structure, within the union with slaveholders. And you can see Lincoln. He's a moderate anti-slavery man who wrestles with this throughout the 1850s, his prelude to greatness, right? Where his anti-slavery principles are balanced by his loyalty to the Union and the Constitution. That breaks up during the Civil War. When the slaveholders commit treason, and you have the Slaveholders Rebellion, as it was called then, rightfully, you actually freed up a person like Lincoln to act on his anti-slavery principles. So that's the difference. And sometimes it's difficult because you can see the Republican Party itself move from non-expansion to abolition to Black rights during Reconstruction. But the difference is really between movement activists and politicians who have to act within the constraint of a certain constitutional and political system. That's the way I see it. Many historians see no difference, but I do see a difference. The second question that you had, Jane, what was that? I'm afraid
it was about the balance in Congress.
Oh, right.
Really,
so this is what,
did we see the northern members of Congress fighting against Jim Crow, and how what did Congress do about Jim Crow?
That's again a very good question, because what happens is that once you had emancipation and the 14th Amendment, the 3/5 clause was no longer relevant. The tragedy of Jim Crow was it gave Southerners even more power because they could count the entire Black population, right? It was not at a 3/5 level, but at a 5/5 level as a whole. So it gave them even more power in Congress while they completely disenfranchised African Americans. So this was a big tragedy. And Southerners blocked not only anti-lynching legislation or voting rights acts or bills to establish a national education system. These are all these ideas, progressive ideas that are percolating at that time. Southerners managed to block that. They managed to block progressive legislation many times. This is when Southerners start using filibuster, to block progressive legislation. So the tragedy is that they get even more power with Jim Crow than even the slaveholders had, because they get it at 5/5. They count their entire Black population, but they completely disfranchise them.
Wow. Well, one final question. There are many, many questions. We could keep this conversation going for another hour, but we try to be respectful of your time and our people's time. On what basis did the Supreme Court find the Civil Rights Act of 1865 or 1875 unconstitutional, and how did that change for 1965?
I am so sorry to say that the United States Supreme Court has many times acted against American democracy. You begin with the Dred Scott decision, right? Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, which makes Lincoln issue his most eloquent appeal against slavery in 1857. Then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, that recognizes the legality of segregation, racial segregation. But in between, the United States Supreme Court systematically dismantles many of these Reconstruction laws and curtails and constrains the purview of many of these constitutional amendments, like the 14th Amendment. You can go back, there are many such cases, Cruikshank, Slaughterhouse, and then the 1883 civil rights cases where they declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. And comes from a very rigid, outdated states' rights philosophy and an outdated conservative philosophy that tries to constrain the actions of the federal government. Unfortunately, that kind of legal conservatism, that kind of inability to think of the Constitution as a living document that would meet the needs of American citizens forever actually does damage to our Constitution, because they interpret things so narrowly and so legally that they end up constraining many of these laws. So even though many of these conservatives said they were very mindful of the original intent of the framers of these amendments and laws, they actually went completely against their intent. So they said the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional because the federal government could not actually mandate what states and what private citizens do. So you're allowed to discriminate, states were allowed to discriminate, states' rights purviews were greater, all kinds of legal reasoning that completely constrains these acts. Perhaps the biggest travesty was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court then used to protect corporations. Rather, it was meant for freed people, for former slaves. And they said, no, this is really meant to protect corporations from regulation by state government. This they did later on. So they kind of not only constrained the 14th Amendment in terms of how it could apply to formerly enslaved people, which is exactly why it was passed, but they used it to protect corporations from not being regulated in terms of, hours of work or minimum wage or safety conditions for workers and consumers. So it's a sorry history. And except for that brief period during the civil rights movement, the Supreme Court tends to act more conservatively than the legislative branch. Congress is far more mindful, I think, to democratic opinion because it's an elected body. And since the senators became popularly elected, we passed a constitutional amendment to make senators popularly elected. In the progressive era, there were attempts to do the same with the president, but that has never happened. But that kind of democratic sway that Congress has makes it more mindful, I think, of the importance of these democratic ideas and principles. It is the lawmaking authority. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, and especially in the recent past with dismantling the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and allowing big money into our elections with the Citizens United decision, has, I think, narrowed rather than broadened the boundaries of American democracy.
Well, Dr. Sinha, thank you so very much. You have absolutely enlightened us. And I know that several people are asking what books should they read. And so if you send us a list of books, we do send a note to everybody who signed in and signed up, thanking them for coming with a link to the video for this. We will send them those books that you think are, give us 5 or 7 books if someone was going to read more about this, and we will share that. I also know that some people are having problems accessing The prior videos from the More Perfect Union series, we will put instructions about how to access them through the website in the email confirmation that we send to